Welcome to the Lean Learning Center podcast. I'm Chris, joined by my co-host Bill Artsberger. Together we're unpacking the power of lean methodologies to transform your approach to business and to enhance your efficiency. Whether you're a seasoned lean practitioner or just beginning, this is your go-to resource for transformative lean thinking. Let's get started. All right, excited to have you guys on our new episode of the Lean Learning Center podcast. I'm Chris Cottle, president of Lean Learning Center. This is Bill Artsberger, previous president of Lean Learning Center. We're just kind of going through a conversation of some of the success stories that we've had with vehicle manufacturing and an OEM vehicle manufacturing provider. So, Bill, why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of your experience with them and who they are and start from there?
Sure. Of course, we've done a lot of work in automotive manufacturing. It's kind of where my engagement started. Grew up in the Detroit area and did a lot of work with the big three, et cetera, over the years. And a lot of that was process improvement and lean improvement. But I'd like to talk a little bit about Oshkosh. People may not be familiar with them. A lot of people think of Oshkosh B'gosh when I say that. And that's not the company we're talking about.
Right.
They don't make clothing. So Oshkosh B'gosh makes clothing, thinks about kids' clothes. But Oshkosh actually is a large equipment and heavy vehicle manufacturing company based in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So they make the fire trucks that are probably in your town, Pierce fire trucks. They make the large fire trucks that are at your airport, probably those big green and yellow and red trucks that you see, the response vehicles, the emergency response vehicles. They make large military trucks. One's called the Hemet. They make the recovery vehicles that are used off-road. They also have a division called JLG that makes the man lifts, the things that you see where people are lifting up heavy equipment and doing installations alongside buildings or inside buildings all over. And they also make the MRAP and cement mixers, some of the equipment that you see that's hauling heavy construction equipment, etc. So they're a very large OEM, been in business for over 100 years. Great company to work with. We started working with them between 15 and 20 years ago and worked with them for a long time and still do. Engagement started out with some assessment and some conversations around how we can help them get better. They really had a big drive and still do to this day to continuously get better and improve their quality, improve their throughput, and make better vehicles, make higher quality products. So we did some assessment. We did some assessment work with them initially. We have a complex, I would say a complex and integrated layered assessment process that we use on occasion. We did that and discovered a lot of opportunity and picked the MRAP, the one area where they were making, I would say, more continuous or high volume production as opposed to low volume. So this was closer to a repetitive manufacturing area. And we had a high engagement with their leadership. So the C-suite was very engaged with what we were doing. The CEO was coming to all our early sessions and very much interested in. So they were doing more than just supporting this effort. They were actually engaged. They were part of it. They actually played a role in some of the coaching and teaching as we went forward. But we started out with building the background.
What were some of the issues they were facing that you started out with that kind of got us engaged in the first place?
Well, they had some quality issues that they were struggling with, repetitive quality issues that they wanted to drive out. They had some volume and some capacity issues where they weren't meeting the volume and delivery that they really wanted to, that their customer was demanding. And when we did the assessment, we focused on that MRAP area, and we also did some follow-ups in the Pierce fire truck delivery area too. So that was a little lower volume, more not quite as repetitive. But they wanted to focus on making those kind of improvements, but also driving a culture around following up on the quality issues that were coming up from the vehicles and the safety engagement across the plant floor. And as we walked through their plant floor, particularly in the MRAP area, we noticed that it wasn't very well organized. There was a lot of confusion as to where parts were supposed to be going. They would arrive at the wrong spots on the side of the assembly line sometimes. Then they would have to be moved back to another area. It was kind of chaotic, we'll say there. So the product that was coming out the end frequently had to be, well, of course, they were all getting inspected, but they had to be reworked quite frequently. So they wanted to kind of eliminate that and go to a first time quality process where the vehicles that came off the end were 100% right, correct, no defects, first pass, first time through. So that
Sure.
those were the goals, and those were the kind of things that we ran into.
What were some of the problems that companies face when they try to make that effort, and what are some of the reasons that they fail at being able to pump out a quality product the first time?
Well, the typical problems, and this was very typical for them too, is they started putting in some inspections at the end of the assembly line. Since they had defects or they were having problems, they were inspecting a little more thoroughly and fixing at the end of the line. So their focus was on delivering higher quality, not necessarily building higher quality. They were inspecting in the quality, and they upped the inspection teams and the rework area. You'll see this in a lot of manufacturing areas. So they were doing a lot of firefighting. They weren't solving the problem. They didn't when a problem came out on a vehicle, they didn't look at it and try and determine why did this happen in the first place? Where did this come from? And how can we prevent it from happening ever again? It was how do we get this fixed right now so we can get the product out the door? And
Sure.
as a as a plant manager and a production leader for many years, I've been there. I could say
Mhm.
that we're all under that pressure to okay, we've got this, let's fix it and get it out the door, and then we go whew, done. Got those done, all problem solved, and we go on to the next one, or we go on to the next day, and we don't have that discipline to come back and say, well, why did this happen? Why did yesterday happen? Let's make today a little bit better. Let's make tomorrow even better yet. How can we do that? So our early efforts were to, of course, they had to continue the firefighting effort. They had to keep doing the efforts to keep delivering for the customers, but at the same time, we had to start instilling some root cause based problem analysis in their systems so that the problems would start going away and
Right.
we could.
So to clarify for our listeners that haven't heard our previous podcast, one of the philosophies that we have at Lean Learning Center is there's a difference between problem solving and firefighting, is what we call it. Problem solving is you have a problem that's coming up, and you get down to the root cause of why that's happening, and then if you solve that problem, you never really see it come up again. Whereas with firefighting, you have a problem, you deal with that particular problem right now, but those issues keep continuing to come up over and over again.
Yeah, I like to ask the question, are you solving the same problems every day? Or are you seeing the same problems every day or every week or every month? Are they popping up over and over again? And inevitably say, oh yeah, yeah, we continually run into this, we continually run into that. And then I'll say, well, we're not really doing problem solving then, because by definition, problem solving means you make the problem go away. It doesn't
Right.
doesn't happen again and again. So what you're doing in that case is firefighting. So that's what you're referring to, Chris.
Yep.
That's and you have to do that sometimes. You've got something that came off the end of the line. You're going to fix it before you can send it on. The last person you want to find your problem is the customer. You want to make sure that you're never sending out a bad product. But the objective is to build it right the first time, so you have high quality in your process. And to do that, if you do have a defect that pops up, you need to find out where it is. So
Right.
our efforts focused on designing in mechanisms that would alert to problems and defects early on in the process. So we would know about them from the very beginning and we could fix them early on. We didn't leave the defect in it till it came all the way to the end of the assembly line, because sometimes they're very difficult to fix because they happened way back in the beginning of the assembly line. If we find it right away, we can make decisions on fixing it right away, but we can also then change the process so that the problem isn't happening in the first place. So we installed air proofing techniques, visual aid, lots of visual controls out on the floor so they would alert you to how something is supposed to work. So you would know right away as you were building it what good was supposed to be every step of the way. And it became really obvious to all of the assembly operators and all the stations what good was supposed to be at each station. And if it wasn't what it was supposed to be, you could stop right then and there, not only fix that particular product, do a little firefighting, but also open up a problem solving process to then go back and figure out how did this happen. And we taught and they continued to use a real structured problem solving analysis process where it would define the problem, go back and grab the data, and then it will allow us to do some in-depth root cause analysis on it to figure out why this happened. And we could put some error proofing in place, or change the product or change the process, change the procedure, whatever we needed to do to make sure that that problem did not ever happen again. And that was the main core of the crux of what we were doing. But to support that, in addition to the error proofing and the visual aids we put in place, we also did supportive tools such as 5S, real good organization, real good line side material delivery, making sure that we had real good connections between all of the different stations. We call that connecting all the customers and suppliers. We had really good flow, where before the product might take 6 different paths to get to where it needed to be, we made it specific so it would only go one way and it would be very clear, good signals all the time. The makeup of the plant floor changed dramatically. When we walked through it originally, I said it was a little bit chaotic. Things weren't always in the right spot. There was a little bit of clutter. Now, as we started over the years making changes and teaching these processes to the plant and the operators, then the plant floor changed. Now it kind of looked beautiful. It looks beautiful today. It's very organized, very, very well put together. The process is very well documented. You'll see a lot of controls. You'll see and-on systems in place. You'll see them using the problem-solving processes repetitively or at each station. It's kind of a beautiful, wonderful thing to take a look at the before and after of what's happening at that line in the MREP line. And I mentioned earlier the way we did that, we had a lot of management and high level engagement, and we helped them stand up a whole lean department or whole lean division where they hired and trained some of the process improvement specialists, and we helped train them. They then became we did a lot of train the trainer, so to speak. They became the coaches and the mentors. We ran the lean experience repetitively for everybody that was in the plant, and we actually licensed, and they continue to use the lean experience and branded it the Oshkosh experience. Everybody went through it, and everybody continues to go through it to this day. That came on board when they have new people that come on board. They want to make sure they understand their systems and their thinking. So the Oshkosh manufacturing system and the process that they use, but they also understand how problems are solved. This is how we work together. This is our culture. This is what we do. This is how we cooperate with each other. This is the way the teams engage with each other, how we establish high agreement on what we're doing. And when we do see something that's not right, this is what we do. We don't fix it real quick and send it down the road. We fix it, and then we start a problem solving process to make sure that it doesn't continue to happen.
Sure.
So that department grew. They continued to train and engage with their coaches, their mentors. They became black belts internally. They continued to use the class, and they got larger and larger. We became very proficient in the MRAP area, or the high volume area, on making really, really high quality products. As a matter of fact, I think it's probably been 10, 15 years now. They won a big contract with the Department of Defense because they had the best quality vehicle that was out there. It wasn't necessarily the lowest cost, but it was the best quality. It met all of the requirements that the Department of Defense had. It was one of the only vehicles that did that. And they were one of the only ones that had very little inspection coming from the Department of Defense because their quality was so high. They never found any problems. They kind of stopped inspecting them from the customer standpoint. Of course, they were inspecting them internally a little bit, and
but the customer trusted that they were delivering a quality product, it sounds like.
Right. The customer trusted they're delivering a quality product. It met all the requirements of what they needed to do. It was the best one.
So that was what's kind of coming to mind is, a lot of companies who are in manufacturing have probably tried to spin up lean thinking and lean methodologies within their organization. What are some of the roadblocks that they run into when they try to do that?
Well, there's multiples. One of them is you might focus on just a tool. For instance, we could have just focused on 5S. Said, well, we're going to organize this plant, and we're going to make sure that people can find what they need to. It's a little safer environment to work in. And of course, those things happen with 5S, but that's not the thinking behind it or why you put it in. It was put in to help us solve problems and expose them early on. But if you focus just on that tool and you'll understand the thinking behind it, we like to say rules, not tools. So we understand
Right.
the thinking behind it first before we put something in, because there's 285 different tools in your toolbox. You got to pick the right one for the right application. And so that's a big barrier that a lot of companies will have. They'll they'll see something and they think that, ooh, it really worked there, so let's plop it in here. Lots of examples, 5S or andons or kanbans, or you put them in, but if it's not the right solution in for your situation, then it'll fail. And even if it is a good solution for your situation, if those that are putting it in and those that are using it and the ones that have to maintain it, because the world changes, right? Things change every day, particularly in today's world. So they need to understand how to maintain that process and how to maintain that tool. So then they need to understand that thinking behind it, what's driving the logic behind it. So we had a very high focus on the principles and rules and the thinking, the culture change behind it was really key to that, not just plopping in and doing something because somebody said so.
Sure. And it sounds like there's been times where, people have, there may be some people who have learned lean, understand lean thinking, and they're in the organization and they're trying to push that forward. So they develop some processes and some improvements that need to be made to the process, but then getting the team to conform and actually do those things is a challenge sometimes.
Sure. Yeah, that's a big focus that we missed early on in the early days of doing this. We just grab something, oh, this looks good, and plop it in, where we really need to focus on that thinking and the culture change behind it and why we're making the change, and understanding that everybody will have resistance to change too. Developing the high agreement and the process behind it means developing a way to overcome the resistance to change. And we have techniques and methodology that we'll use in high engagement areas to drive that culture and that leadership. Having In this case, having a high amount of leadership engagement and participation in the process really helped a lot, and they've been very successful at doing that.
Sure. Were there any sort of supply chain issues that you helped with in this particular case? Or have you helped in a similar manner in this industry?
So sure, as you start looking at your processes and what's happening internally, that's always the first focus in changing your culture. Inevitably, it then, after a few years of doing this, it then kind of sprinkles out to your suppliers. You'll discover things that they're doing that aren't necessarily correct for you and aren't the right things to do. You need to decide how you engage with them and make sure that we're doing it in a positive way. So you're kind of partnering with them, making sure that they understand you're trying to improve the process for both of you. You're not just beating them over the head, making demands on them. Hey, I want this delivered differently, or I need it delivered faster. I need it delivered to a different spot. I need the product to be a little bit different. It needs to be higher quality. It may not be meeting this need, and here's why. My customer wants this, and when I go to assemble it, I'm having this struggle and this problem. It needs to meet this requirement a little bit better, and I need to bring it in on a little different methodology. So this kind of spawned the thinking of ILVS, which is inline vehicle sequencing. You see it in automotive OEM quite a bit, and they're doing that now in some of the smaller areas too, and spawn that partnership with suppliers to now form that bond of having good connections and where they bring the product and where it's delivered, so that JIT, just in time, kind of came from that. Where do I get it, and where does it get delivered, and what kind of quality levels do I need at the right spot? So they did some of that there, of course, and you'll see that being used predominantly in a lot of larger volume OEMs in automotive, particularly, but even in aerospace and some of the smaller volume heavy vehicle manufacturing, you'll see that quite a bit too. We got the opportunity to work with a few of their suppliers, and of course would like to work with some more of them, and I know they're expanding upon that as well.
Sure. What are some of the ways that you've used technology to help with some of these systems and processes?
Well, technology will drive a lot of the ways that they will recognize errors on the floor instead of just putting your hand up. For instance, for an andon, we'll now have a reporting system that we'll use, how to report defects and errors, but also to get the orders and the information out to the right spot at the right time. If you have a very consistent product that's the same, you're doing the same thing at every station, it's not quite as important if you have a product that changes a lot. So when we moved into the Pierce fire truck area, for instance, all of those vehicles are different. Every single one that they build is specific and very customized, depending on what that particular department or the fire chief in your town wants on their vehicle. I discovered that there's a couple hundred different shades of red, for example, the different colors that they paint. I thought there was only one. Do you want your vehicle red or orange or green? But in fact, there's a lot of variability to it. So technology and the way that information is delivered played a big role in making sure that the quality of the build and the assembly and the information that got delivered to each of the stations was correct every single time. And then, of course, the information that went up and down throughout the systems and the connection out to the suppliers that are outside of the building plays a big role. We used to send orders, and it was a lot of manual updates. Now it's all electronic. You've got the, you know, uh, electronic order systems, advanced order processing that's coming in, and keeping that in sync can make a big difference, and keeping your quality high. Of course, if it gets out of sync, it can make a big difference too. You're also seeing what they're calling the Internet of Things, or Industry 4.0, where now we're connecting the assembly processes and the machines at each station. So now they're talking to each other and they're gathering data, not only product information and process information, counts, assembly, and what we call OEE information, and defects and rates, run weights can all be collected now and brought up on an hourly basis back to a central location. So now we have a proliferation of data on the floor that you can use to make decisions faster, and you can spot problems. Back to when we first started doing this, trying to find a problem and getting it proliferated up through the line, it took a little bit of time. You had to manually fill out a form. Well, now it can be electronically triggered, and we can see an alert that happens, but the alert can then go back to a manager that can see it right away, and he can make a response and help with error proofing and error resolution. That problem solving process we talked about earlier, can find it much quicker. But we have to be careful with that. When we first started putting in the data collection, it was just a bombardment of data that wasn't necessarily good data that was usable. It was just a whole bunch of data. So the way you parse that and the way you look at it, that exception reporting can be an important component of that too.
Sure. And so OEE is overall equipment effectiveness, right?
Correct. Right.
Yeah. And then do you think it's possible to get an OEE score up to
Sure. 100%, it would mean what you define that as being 100%, because there's lots of different ways to calculate OEE. But what it really boils down to is how much time and how much productivity is this machine capable of doing, and then how much planned uptime do I get out of it, and how much unplanned downtime or interruptions to that are happening. If you're planning to run your machine 20 hours out of a 24-hour day, and you succeed on doing that, and then you plan on getting X amount of production, you've determined that its capability is this amount per hour, and you're reaching that for that planned uptime, you're getting really close to that 100% OEE. But then that other 4 hours that you're supposed to be down, what are you using that for? Is it preventative maintenance? I call it PM1 and PM2, preventative maintenance or predictive maintenance. How are you doing that? And they're doing any changeovers, updates to the equipment, anything that you're doing in that time. So why not do that faster? So now instead of having 20 hours of runtime, so maybe I have 21 or 22. So you can always expand upon that and increase your capacity with very little capital expenditure by making sure your equipment is up and running and it's being maintained very, very well the whole time. If
Sure.
that makes sense, I hope that does.
Yeah. So what challenges do you face in keeping up with market trends in this industry space?
Market trends for manufacturing, or?
Yeah, for manufacturing, what are some of the ways that you can foster innovation to address market changes within your organization?
Well, a lean organization will be able to respond to changes much faster because everybody understands the process and how they respond. They have very structured operations, very structured procedures that they follow. There's not nine different ways or six different ways to do something. There's just one. So when they need to make a change to respond to a market demand, they can change that one process. They can test it, prove it out, and then put it in production very quickly. They also have good connectivity between what they're doing between each other. They have high agreement amongst what they're doing, and they'll be able to respond to those changes very quickly. The markets are always changing, and some of the companies will really struggle, particularly in a manufacturing environment, to make updates to that because they didn't have a good clear cut way of doing that. So their structure for switching over wasn't easy to do, and their methodology for making changes was difficult because they had so many different ways of doing something.
Right, and it seems like some teams have probably experienced where maybe one shift is more productive than another shift because of experience or skills or what have you. Um, and so a lot of that comes from, what they've learned and how to be as effective as they can in producing some of this stuff. And then when you become a learning organization, you can learn from the best in your organization to make sure that those processes get put in place for all of the entire team.
Well, sure, that's a good point. Many of the organizations, and this was true even in vehicle manufacturing, relied heavily on tribal knowledge. So what you're getting to is why does one team or why does one person outperform another? Usually they've been there longer and they built up some internal tribal knowledge. So they're doing things a little bit differently. The experience has taught them that I need to do this as opposed to that. They're following their own internal process. They've taken little shortcuts, so they've come up with their own methodologies. And sometimes those are producing really good results, but not necessarily always. Sometimes they're producing good results for them, but they're tanking the next step in the process. So the difference between we'll say, more chaotic manufacturing environment and a very organized and lean one that's following a learning organization process would be that they're shifting from tribal knowledge to a more organizational knowledge process. So as we discover new things, we have a process for doing that. Well, as you know, rule 4 is learn through experimentation, and we do experimentation together as a group instead of individually one person on one shift deciding that he's going to try something different. They get together as a team and decide that they're going to hypothesize, let's make this change and see what happens. And then if the changes are good for them, for that team, and they're good for the this next steps down the line, they're good for the steps up above, then they decide that they're going to implement it. When they make the decision to implement a change, then they do that in a very structured, organized manner. Well, they'll go back and they'll change the single way they do the process now, and of course, educate everybody on the team that's impacted by it on what the new process is. So they move from version 1 to version 2 and version 2 to version 3 together. They have one
Sure.
way that they're doing it, and it's a very structured process. So that's organizational knowledge. With the tribal knowledge method, when I discovered something better or you discovered something better, we didn't necessarily share it with anybody else. Kind of held it to our chest, or we never had the opportunity, or nobody ever asked us about doing that. Oh, I just got better at doing this. Well, why did you get better at doing it? So now when we learn something new, we make sure that it really is beneficial, and we make sure that everybody does it the same way so everybody benefits from that knowledge, and we kind of foster that amongst ourselves, making sure that we're valuing that team approach higher than we are the individual approach. And this kind of elevates the more experienced people that are in your organization to be more coaches and trainers, etc. But any information that they come up with or ideas they have, now they can move on to the entire team so everybody can hear about it. And it sort of gives them a better stature too. Sort of the opposite of quashing innovation. It sort of exposes it and fosters innovation, as you mentioned earlier. It helps them get better and better as a company and as a team. And exposing that and encouraging that is really the key to what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say is one of the major things that you would give as advice to somebody who's trying to instill a lean thinking, learning organization philosophy within their team?
Well, lots of things to think about, of course, but the the first thing to take a look at is where are you right now? Where is my, we'll say process maturity, because you probably haven't even heard about lean or done any continuous improvement yet. But if you're very beginning of your process, and this is a whole nother road mapping discussion we can get into, and maybe we need to do this a little bit later. This will be interesting. But taking a look at where I stand right now, what's my process maturity? And it could be just in one area, or you could be looking at it on a more wider scale, but understanding it piece by piece, because you'll find some big differences amongst your organization if you have a larger company. Smaller companies, maybe not so much, but parts of your, one department may be quite a bit different than another department, and I'm saying different from a process maturity level.
Sure.
That just sort of naturally happens over time. People sometimes figure this out and start working, I'll say together a little bit better, and start doing some of these things naturally because they make sense, where other ones don't necessarily do that. So you have to ask, when I say process maturity, take a look at, are the processes and the activities that I'm doing very well structured right now? So are they very common? Is there just one way to do something? Is everybody following that one consistent methodology that we're using, or are they using lots of different ways? So any particular step you look at, we like to say we look at activities, connections, and flows. Are the activities they're doing very consistent and very structured? If they're not, those are some of the first things we need to look at, is gaining that structure and gaining that consistency. If there's, I said earlier, if there's 9 or 7 or 6 different ways of doing something, getting it down to just one method, maybe it's not even the world-class best method, but having one is a major step. And getting it to that point where now I can start making improvements, and now we're improving just one process. And if I do have a problem, I know which one made it, because there's only one way that we use. Not,
Okay.
gee, was it process number 3, or was it method number 4, or who knows, what's happening. So those are things to look at. Am I process maturity? Are very structured at what we're doing? Do we have good connections between all our stations, our customers and suppliers internally? Is there a good connection for material flow and product flow? Is there good process flow in place already? So those are those first 3 rules we talked about last time. Am I following those? So I say look for the rule violation, or do I have very few of them, or do I have a lot of them? Is it just disconnected and sort of chaotic to begin with? And those are the first things that you'll want to work on, putting the rule violations in place, even if it's not the most efficient, et cetera, but get that in place and start driving that. And then as you're doing those, and you're teaching and coaching and talking about this with the people you're engaging with, letting them know why you're doing that, and understanding the reasons behind it, that the customers, what their driving demands are. They need products faster, or they need higher quality. And for us to stay in business and keep our jobs and keep doing what we're doing, it's important that we respond to these market demands that you mentioned, and we respond to the customer demands, and we get really good at doing that. And this is how we're going to do that. And then we'll say all the individuals that you're working with will begin to understand it, and will have buy-in to what you're doing, and they'll start to change that culture. They have sort of act like owners a little bit. They'll start thinking about what the customer wants. We change their viewpoint a little bit. And then you can introduce the principles, those 5 principles we talked about a little earlier. It's important to start having that conversation early on, start driving the thinking behind why we're doing what we're doing. The 5 principles, following along with the 4 foundational rules, should be some of the first things that we do when we start looking at driving an organization toward process maturity, and driving them toward a leaner environment, and getting them better and better and better at what they're doing, changing that culture. Instead of just going in, I made this mistake 30 years ago, plopping in and putting in a tool, or trying to change something because I said so. I was the plant manager, and you do what I say. Making sure that they understand why we're doing that, and eliciting their feedback, having good AARs at what we're doing. Are you familiar with that terminology of what an AAR is, or should we explain that to everybody?
Yeah, it's a good thing to explain it to the new listeners, for people who are not aware of kind of some of the stuff we're doing.
So an AAR is referring to an after action review. So having good AARs, doing them, a debrief, just getting response and getting feedback from everybody in a non-confrontational manner is really important as you're doing this, because you're going to make a lot of mistakes when you start putting this in. Not everything you do will work out perfectly. Some things will work out really great. Other ones you'll stumble with and you'll make mistakes. And getting feedback from everybody, making sure that they understand they're part of this. They own this system just as much as you do, or just as much as any other individual in there. Everybody has a role to play, and everybody has an important part of that process, and their voice is important. So that
How often
structure.
should we do an AAR typically?
Well, that's a good question. Doing them frequently at the every time you make a change, or when you're having meetings, or you're talking about processing, you put reviews in, doing them at key points and telling people about them ahead of time, and so they understand what it is. It boils down to asking some questions, really four primary questions. One is, what did we expect to happen? What really happened? Why that happened, and what can we do differently next time? So you're trying to learn and drive that learning. So as you do an experiment and you try something out, or you put a change in place, asking these questions on a very frequent basis and making sure you have engagement means that you're not doing it punitively. You don't do an AAR or pull it out as a weapon. I've seen that happen in some places where when everything's going smoothly, everybody's happy, and we're making some changes, and we're getting the results that we expect. Everybody's just moving forward. But when all of a sudden we make a change, or we do an experiment and we don't get the results we want, or we get a complaint, then all of a sudden, oh, we better pull out an AAR. We're going to find out why that happened. And that's not really how you want to use them. You want to make sure that
They should be a
you're using.
consistent thing that happens regularly,
Right,
just to keep
right.
improving. Sounds like,
Yep,
and
yep.
it sounds like the schedule is different for each organization. You kind of have to come to an agreement as a team as to how often you should have them.
Right, right. It'll depend on what you're doing. If you're making a lot of changes and you're being very aggressive on what you're doing, you'll be doing them frequently. If you're not, you'll still want to be doing AARs when you have meetings, or when you're maybe at the end of a shift, or at the end of a week. You'll have a quick debrief. How'd things go today? How do I know if I can tell if I had a good day or not? What does good look like? Anything you see that's not hitting the mark, so to speak, or any defects we found, or any processes. And then you can talk about any opportunities for improvement as well. Maybe things are going the way they should be per se, but they could be better. So then we get deeper into the other principles, that waste elimination or process improvement, where we can make them better. And AARs can play a key role in that too, getting the feedback. Hey, we tried to remove this waste here, or do this process faster, and it really tripped us up down here. We ended up with more inventory, or we ended up with more scrap. And getting that feedback will allow you to respond not only to the market demands, but also the demands of what you're changing, and your customer demands at the same time. So that's an important tool, an important process to foster in your culture, making sure that everybody understands they play a role. And we need to do what I said in an environment that's non-confrontational. And I like to use the term, I know you've heard me use this before, CLMs. What a
Rick,
That's
explain what that is.
a career limiting move. So we need to make sure that nobody does this, or is exposed to any type of a CLM when they're offering feedback or response to anybody. Hey, boss, this didn't work out quite right, or hey, team member, what we're doing isn't getting us the results we like, right? We'll have to say, oh, thanks for that feedback. Let's see what we can do about making the change. Not, oh, I don't like you anymore. Well, that's not my fault. It's yours. It's not my problem. It's your problem. You fix it. That
Right.
confrontational exposure. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. And as leaders, we need to be constantly vigilant to make sure that doesn't happen in our teams and environments. And we're making sure that we are humble, and that we listen, and we play that role as much, because our teams will take cues from us as we move forward, making sure
Right.
that they're being treated the same way, and they're treating their team members the same way that we're treating them. That's really key.
Yeah, and you get value from your team telling you like, hey, we weren't able to accomplish this, and this because these systems weren't up to par as to what we need to do. We have to go back to the drawing board and figure out how we can make sure we can deliver on that. And the boss above them might be concerned about that because they want to make sure that they reach their goals. And so rather than reaching for blame, who's at fault, to focus on how do we fix the system so that everybody can be successful at doing that.
Right.
Great.
That's
Well, those are
important.
some good points on in the manufacturing space, particularly vehicle manufacturing and OEM space. We'll sign off for this episode and look forward to our next one next week. Thanks, Bill, for coming on.
Great. Appreciate it. It was a great discussion. Thanks, Chris.
That's a wrap for today's episode. Thanks for joining us, and don't forget to visit leanlearningcenter.com for more insights and resources. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of efficiency and innovation. Thanks for listening.